All right, so a little introduction to how I came here. I actually started with state parks at Schuyler Mansion in Albany. So direct connection there. Angelica's born, well, she's not born at Schuyler Mansion. We'll get into that in a moment. That is where she lived most of her life, however. And so was really interested. I actually wrote a program while I was working there about the women of Schuyler Mansion in general, and then after the Hamilton musical came out and we had a whole another level of interest coming into the house, I realized that there was a lot of information lacking, especially about the women of the family. And so but suddenly a lot of interest about it. And so as I started kind of developing more information about the Schuyler sisters, I became very interested in Angelica's story in particular, and especially how misrepresented I felt that she had been in mostly the only things that had been written about her up to that point, which was biographies of men in her life. And so in 2017, I left, sort of, I semi-left state service to work at, to begin my dissertation, my PhD program. And so the title you're seeing here is my dissertation title. But this is kind of a two-part talk today because I'm gonna give you this sort of overview of what my dissertation is, what I'm interested in, what I'm arguing about with Angelica, as well as just telling you some cool anecdotes about her life. But then Mary Kay also asked me to kind of talk about the family connections that the Schuylers have here in Oswego, because there are some kind of surprising direct ones, although she herself never probably came here, but only because she had died by the point that the rest of her family was coming out here. All right, so I'm going to jump right into, again, kind of the dissertation portion of my talk. I'll admit this is not going to be a smooth transition between these two, but let's get started. So when talking about Angelica, I always start with a letter that really caught my attention when we found it at Schuyler Mansion. On July 4th, 1776, Angelica Schuyler wrote to her father, the Major General Philip Schuyler, reporting a Tory assassination plot discovered 2 weeks prior aimed at George Washington and other revolutionary leaders in New York City. Her information was accurate, surprisingly so, since the plot was still being investigated by a secret council, and their minutes were not released until the 19th century. In the same letter, she explained an interaction she had with Lady Mary Watts Johnson. This was a loyalist prisoner who was held captive at the time by Philip Schuyler. Angelica, at the end of the letter, begs for her father's approval of her actions, saying, "If you approve this, I shall applaud myself for it. If not, my future conduct must be improved by your example." This interaction is really typical of Angelica's relationship with her father. She shows herself to be interested in political and military affairs, aware of her social position, deferential to her father, and even eager for his approval, which is why it initially seems shocking that only a year later she elopes without her parents' permission. Her new husband, John Barker Church, was using an alias at the time, John Carter, at least in part to mask his activities as an Englishman who was helping the Continental Congress. Thus, the couple marries without parental permission. So I started thinking early in my dissertation, how do we reconcile this seemingly rebellious marriage with Angelica's previously obedient sort of correspondence with her father? And what I came up with is that both interactions are attempts for her to establish legal, political, and economic influence in a time where laws often incapacitated women in these ways. Angelica instead built power through a complex and deliberate network of interpersonal relationships, particularly those that she formed with men, those elite actors who had all the rights that she lacked. Further, while Angelica is a historically visible example of this type of networking, I don't think that she was anomalous. Angelica's peers, including her sisters Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, Margaret Peggy Schuyler Van Rensselaer, and others like Abigail Adams and the loyalist Mary Watts Johnson, who I mentioned just a moment ago, they built these networks of men and women with whom they studied, discussed, and even participated in politics, philosophy, finances, military matters. And these networks allowed Angelica to direct money in support of her politics, to pass military intelligence during the American Revolution, and to aid refugees later in the French Revolution. Now, I'm hardly reinventing the wheel here. I'm building on the works of other historians, and a couple that particularly sort of sparked my interest is Susanna Shaw Romney, whose book's on the left here, who argues that interpersonal relationships allowed women to participate in the building of colonial New Netherland. And of course, Angelica is from a Dutch family, so she's really building on those New Netherlands women's culture. And then by Cassandra A. Good, who argues that 18th century men and women formed loving, politically significant friendships that were crucial to the formation of a new political system. And that may not sound too revolutionary, but this 2018 book is actually one of the first to suggest that women and men could be just friends without also having a sexual relationship. In the 18th century, of course. So I'm building on these concepts and hope to make them more accessible by applying them to a very visible case study, since the Hamilton musical has sort of pushed Angelica to the forefront. Now, another quote I want to bring up is this one by historian Joan Kelly, who suggests that events that further the historical development of men, liberating them from natural, social, or ideological constraints, have different, even opposite effects on women. Now, this is certainly the case in the American Revolution, which results in this liberation of constraints for men, or white men in America, I should say, anyway, and a subsequent restriction on the freedoms of women in the form of what we'll call the cult of domesticity in the early 19th century. But during Angelica's lifetime, which spans 1756 to 1814, I think we can also see an inverse of Kelly's quote. The upheaval of the revolution represented this sort of temporary breakdown of society for men, and this lack of structure lent women like Angelica of the wealth, at least those of the wealthy educated elite, a sort of loosening of the constraints which bound them to the private sphere. So private sphere being home, public sphere being business, military, politics. So this made Angelica's network building and influence even more possible. But before we get too far into theory, let's provide some context for her life. So Angelica Schuyler was born on February 20th, 1756, in the Albany home of her paternal grandmother. So on the left here, we have Cornelia Van Cortlandt Schuyler's Dutch home. Because her parents were both fourth-generation Dutch, Angelica was baptized with the name Engelte. When Angelica was 9, her family finished construction on an 80-acre estate outside Albany, which is now Schuyler Mansion, another state historic site. As the Angelica's, and this is always hard to pronounce together, Anglicization of Angelica's name, and the family's English-style home suggest, lost my place. Angelica and her siblings were raised to acculturate into English society, but they were also really able to leverage their Dutch culture, because at home in Albany, at the start of the American Revolution, about half of Albany citizens still speak Dutch as their first language. Her father, Philip, serves in the British military during the French and Indian War, including up here at Oswego, which we'll talk about towards the end. He acted as a quartermaster under Major General John Bradstreet. This experience, the values he espoused when elected to Albany Assembly, and his extensive land holdings qualified him to be one of the first major generals appointed at the start of the American Revolution in 1775, when Angelica was 19. And here's the whole family tree as I talk about her upbringing. This is from a presentation on the women of Schuyler Mansion, hence Catherine is much larger than Philip here because she's the important character. Now you'll know we don't have portraits of two of the sons, so I actually took portraits of their namesakes and put question marks over their faces. All right. So it's evident from the education that the Schuylers received, and from Philip's letters to his daughters and to his wife, that Philip really values the intellectual capability of women in his family. Philip often shared detailed military, economic, and political news with Catherine, and he encouraged his daughters to learn subjects beyond those proposed by contemporary philosophers of female education. Further, Philip considered relationship building, aka networking, essential, calling it, quote, a tax which we must owe to society, in a letter to his daughter Katie. It could be argued that because no Schuyler boys survived until 9 years after Angelica's birth, Philip expended more on his daughter's intellectual upbringing than many fathers. But sources do seem to suggest that Enlightenment thinking led even the most conservative fathers to broaden the subjects of their daughter's schooling during this time. The Schuyler girls showed no hesitation in pursuing subjects like German, Latin, geography, arithmetic, in addition to the ornamental education requisite of their social class. That included things like drawing and painting, dancing, music, although the boys also got a lot of those things. Evidence of an advanced education is indicated, for example, by one of my favorite quotes. This is Angelica's response to the news that her brother Alexander Hamilton was appointed Secretary of the Treasury. She writes to him, "I shall send by the first ships every well-written book that I can procure on the subject of finance. I cannot help being diverted at the avidity I express to whatever relates to this subject. It is a new source of amusement, or rather, of interest." And she did, in fact, underline that to show it was a pun. I also like that he's just been named, Secretary of Finance, and she's like, "Hey, why don't you read up on that subject? I've been doing a lot of reading." So, tongue-in-cheek though this quote may be, Angelica's comment is notably not self-conscious. She's very confident in expressing an interest in these supposedly men's sphere sort of things like economics. She's completely unfearful of Hamilton's reproach. By the early post-war period, at least, this type of interjection by a woman is clearly not abnormal. She expects this will be received well. And I propose that education is really the thing giving Angelica and her peers the confidence to kind of speak this language, and by being able to speak this language makes them accessible to men and therefore able to influence the ongoing politics, economics, etc. Angelica regularly and unabashedly shared business, political, and military news, and very few of her male correspondents resisted such input. I apologize, by the way, I'm 6 months pregnant, so that's why I keep getting winded while speaking. All right, so we're going to return now to Angelica's 1776 letter, introduced previously. Now, this letter indicates that Angelica was already an active participant in both the public and private sphere at a fairly young age. In her letter, 20-year-old Angelica describes an assassination plot which involved more than 30 people, including David Matthews, who was the Loyalist governor of New York City. Philip had recently left Albany en route to Crown Point, and Angelica sent this letter on his heels. "The idea of a ministerial fleet is lost in our disgust of American perfidy. Mr. Matthews is condemned, and Wallace, Jones, and Beach are confined. The fleet were to have attacked the city on the day on which our conspirators were to have assassinated our worthy generals." Because of the treasonous nature of this event, the secret council charged with prosecuting involved persons had not released any of this information. Certainly, David Matthews' name was floating around because he was the mayor and he got arrested. But other than that, it's really surprising that Angelica reports names that are later confirmed in the secret council's recordings through the end of June. The accuracy and the speed with which Angelica reports this information from New York is also surprising, given that New York was about a week's journey on average. To me, this indicates a connection to a prompt and well-informed rumor mill, if not true military intelligence. While we might propose that maybe Angelica was forwarding information intended for her father, it still begs the question, if this information was not sent to her directly, why did she have access to it instead of the military secretaries stationed at Philip Schuyler's home? So I do believe that she somehow gathered this from friends or family or someone in New York. The postscript of this letter also furnishes a news more local to Angelica referred to at the start. She says, "There was a report in town that Sir John Johnson was dead. Some person had told Lady Johnson. I desired a lady to tell her that he was not dead, but not to mention my name." She follows this with her plea for Philip's approval that I mentioned earlier. Now, this news certainly fits within the bounds of an upper-class woman's role of managing her family's reputation, but it also shows that she's conscious of the sort of diplomacy considering Lady Johnson's status as a political prisoner. Philip Schuyler and a contingent of soldiers had attempted to arrest Lady Johnson's husband, the loyalist John Johnson, in January of that year. When he found that Johnson had already fled the property with many of his tenant farmers and native allies, Philip took Lady Johnson in hopes that John Johnson would eventually surface and come for his wife. Now, Lady Johnson had been moved to a home in Albany where Schuyler could keep a better eye on her. Angelica acted as she believed a woman of her position should, but she also appeals to her father to make sure that it was appropriate in relation to his military strategy. So to some extent, it seems like she might not have developed the sort of confidence in these intrusions from that letter, but obviously had much more conviction by the time she elopes in 1777. Previous historians have dealt with Angelica's marriage to John Carter, quote unquote, only as a foil to Elizabeth's marriage to Alexander Hamilton, or as sort of an inconvenient distraction during Philip's military career. In the predominant narrative, Angelica made a rash choice against her parents' wishes, swayed by the elegance of the mysterious John Carter. Take this description, for example, from a 1902 history. Possessed of dashing manners and an almost godlike beauty, it's small wonder that Church attracted the attention of the maiden. To many historians, the motivation was clear. Church was motivated by a connection to the illustrious Schuyler family, while Angelica was motivated by the charms of an alluring rake. No one has, to my knowledge, considered that Angelica made a very rational choice in her choice of husband here. She's choosing Carter as her partner and her arbiter of her legal and economic power. And her marriage to Carter, whether or not she knew his identity, was a step towards a liberated lifestyle that allowed her to build influence in elite social circles. And there are kind of two questions necessary to my argument here, which is why did Philip and Catherine reject the marriage? And what did a marriage to John Carter actually offer to Angelica? Now, Catherine Schuyler's biographer, Mary Gay Humphreys, answers the first question pretty well. She says, "The mystery concerning Carter proved to be alarming only in the fact that it was a mystery." From the Schuylers' perspective, the problem was that they knew Church by his alias rather than his real name. But it seems that they probably knew it was an alias. But Congress had sent John Carter as a commissioner to audit Philip's military accounts, a capacity in which Philip had no complaints of him, despite him auditing his accounts. After the marriage, though, Philip confirmed that his complaint was one of identity in a letter to William Durer. Unacquainted with his family, his connections, and situation in life, the match was exceedingly disagreeable to me. And Catherine, whose rage and resentment was stronger than Philip's, according to Church, still conceded he had always behaved well to her, and he had no cause to complain of him. It's unclear if Carter revealed his identity to the Schuylers in the aftermath of the elopement, but he didn't do so publicly until the end of the war. Yet even in their rage, the Schuylers didn't complain about Carter's character or question his ability to support Angelica. And in case you think they maybe thought, oh, well, she's already married, no point in criticizing him now. At other points, Philip called one of his son's wife dull, and another most preposterous, a daughter's husband, I should say, most preposterous, after they also eloped. In fact, about half of the children wind up eloping. She's just the leader of the pack. Now, with Church's family unknown, the Schuylers couldn't approve of Carter in the 18th century marital economy. That doesn't mean that Carter didn't have marital value to Angelica, though. Even under alias, Philip was informed that Carter was an old-fashioned English Whig before marriage. Carter was also clearly well-educated, presented himself in a refined manner, and had made himself notable and wealthy working for Congress. All traits that the Schuylers would have valued. The Schuylers probably also shared the 18th century belief that you couldn't fully obtain the traits of gentility without being born into it. So they kind of knew that he must have been from somewhere of a similar social class. Thus, Angelica and her parents must have recognized Carter's economic suitability, even though the blanks in his story worried the parents. Despite this, perhaps Angelica's paramour might have filled her in on some of those blanks during their courtship. We really don't have any letter evidence of this. Or perhaps Angelica just judged Carter on other qualities that appealed to her ambition. Namely, we also know that Carter was also ambitious. He's politically and socially liberal, and well-connected amongst the elite. He's also geographically mobile. So for a girl who grew up in Albany and never left Albany, well, other than to New York City, this would have been good. Get to see some other colonies. So a marriage to church could deliver all those same qualities to Angelica, and they did. The marriage really opened up Angelica's world, allowing her to rapidly develop relationships that brought her power in this 18th century social economy. Church wasn't a soldier, but since he operated a military commissary that moves with the army, she became very much like officers' wives. She becomes this fixture of the camp circuit where they're having balls and all these sort of things. Her wit, charm, and sociability became the topics of Tench Tillman in Albany, James McHenry in Morristown, and the Marquis de Fleury in Newport. Don't have a portrait of him. Later in America, Angelica formed further friendships with the Marquis de Lafayette, the Marquis de Lolly-Tollendale, the Chevalier de Luzerne, and the Baron von Steuben, as well as a soldier-turned-painter, John Trumbull. Now, given the date of Angelica's second pregnancy, she was probably not present when her sister Elizabeth met her soon-to-be husband, Alexander Hamilton, in 1780. But they did meet soon after. Did I miss a click-through? There we go. So the friends likely met later that year. Now, some historians have read their sort of flirtatious letters as an affair, but I believe that this is a misinterpretation. They have kind of a unique bond over the years, and they both have this very needling sense of humor that applies both to each other and also to Elizabeth. So they're always kind of like teasing her and each other in those letters. Despite this, Hamilton was one of Angelica's strongest allies in her quest for influence, and so I really don't think she would have been willing to throw away the power she held in her marriage to Carter, or to Church rather, for this dalliance. Now, after the Revolution, the Churches moved to Europe, and while they're over there, they live in both Paris and London. And Angelica adds to her global network salon artist Richard and Maria Cosway, diplomat Francois Barthélemy, and importantly, Thomas Jefferson, who she meets when he's an ambassador to France. Angelica's relationship with Jefferson, as well as that with John, Abigail, and John Quincy Adams, I think, particularly demonstrate her social tact. None of these people like the rest of her family. And for a sense of the Adams relationship with Philip anyway, when Congress blamed the British capture of Fort Ticonderoga on Philip, John Adams suggested that a solution might be to shoot a general, leaving little doubt as to which general he was referring to. His opinion of Hamilton was no better, and yet the Adams write very pleasantly of the Churches. They go to visit them in Europe. Dan, would you mind getting the charger from the car? Surprised my battery's running low, but there it is. So the Adams write very pleasantly of them, despite their family connections. Similarly, even while Thomas Jefferson is engaged in vicious partisan fighting with the Schuyler and Hamiltons over the course of the new nation, Angelica maintains a friendship with Jefferson through letters. In those letters, she doesn't shy away from politics, but admittedly, Jefferson replies very inconsistently. In the same letter, he once made the comments, "The tender breasts of ladies were not formed for political convulsion," and then also explained the new Constitution to her. So, by the way, the tender breasts of ladies, he was not referring to her, so I think he was doing kind of a, oh, you're not like the other girls. I do also want to mention, because I have a whole chapter of this on my dissertation, sort of talking about the meaning of this, but I do want to point out briefly, these are her maiden correspondences while she lives in England, and it's really notable that there are very few English people here. I think that's significant. She mainly befriends other expatriates and ambassadors of American, French, Italian, and even Polish descent. So even though she married an Englishman, Angelica never views herself as an English woman. Thank you. And has no interest in staying in England long term. Instead, she creates a cosmopolitan network that marks her as an outsider and aligns her with the social and political needs of her American friends and family, not her husband's British one. Angelica was consistent in her letters throughout her time in Europe that this would not remain her permanent home, and that once John got bored with politicking in England, they'd be returning to America, which they did in 1799. In the meantime, Angelica's social circle was also one interested in intellectual pursuits involving both men and women. It was an elite world in which Angelica was able to assert influence with and without her husband. Church, to Angelica's chagrin, joined Parliament. He actually bought a house, an estate, in order to get himself a parliamentary title, so he bought his way in. And he left Angelica feeling really abandoned in their home outside of London. But even in Church's absence, Angelica supported artists including Trumbull and the Cosways. She entertained Gouverneur Morris, John Quincy Adams, and the Count Agenau, who's an Italian prince, I believe. And Angelica didn't just entertain, she acted as a political matchmaker, building transatlantic connections between her contacts. So as example, she sent sent a copy of Hamilton's Federalist Papers to Jefferson, seemingly the first he received. She wrote letters of introduction and recommendation for friends sailing to America, including the Comte de Noailles, Dr. Joseph Priestley, and the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt. What a name. Now, she was also instrumental in introducing French refugees who were fleeing the revolution to Americans who could provide them with aid. Most notably, Angelica arranged for her father to purchase land for the Marquis and Madame de la Tour de Pin. In her journals, which were published later, the Madame de la Tour de Pin wrote, "Mrs. Church, seeing the great maternal interest and tender friendship which animated our aunt, wrote to her relatives, and we received on our arrival in Boston very pressing letters from General Schuyler, in which he urged us to come without delay to Albany, where he assured us we would be able to establish ourselves." These journals, by the way, you can get like on archive.org or whatever. They're a great read. She grows up in the French court, and Schuyler does eventually buy her a piece of property in Menands, New York. And so she goes from living in the French court to milking cows in rural Albany. And she's like having a great time. Her husband is not. So definitely worth a read and easy to access. Now, soon after that interaction, when French revolutionaries imprisoned the Marquis de Lafayette in Olmütz in Austria, Angelica goes on to regularly write on his behalf and becomes an intermediary for parties interested in freeing him. So the letter you're seeing here is from Monsieur de Nilave, who is Lafayette's brother-in-law. And he writes Angelica from Olmütz in this letter, asking her to gather American and French diplomats at her home, hinting at the nature of their meeting by saying it would be a time where we could speak with open hearts, putting aside diplomatic forums. In other words, Angelica's home to provide a place for friends of Lafayette to speak candidly about not necessarily legal means of helping him. And this was not the first meeting that Angelica sort of arranged for this purpose. In fact, where Lafayette was imprisoned in the first place had been kept a secret until Angelica, her husband, and the group of friends that are mentioned throughout this letter hired a man named Justice Eric Bullman, quote, to go to the continent and endeavor to discover Lafayette's place of imprisonment and make efforts of any kind that appeared best calculated to procure his liberation. During this search, Bullman made all of his reports about his attempts to find Lafayette directly to Angelica. He writes this sort of under the guise of a travel journal addressed to a lady friend. And it's complete with a sort of very interesting to a lady. But he's so excited about it, he's going to tell her anyway. And, oh, did you know that Lafayette used to be here? Turns out he got moved. Let's go find out where. Now, Bullman does eventually find Lafayette, and then he recruits a man named Francis Kinloch Huger, and together they attempt to free the Frenchman during a weekly carriage ride that Lafayette was granted to allow him fresh air. They do actually successfully separate Lafayette for his guards, but Lafayette, who is not keyed into the plan, sort of runs off into the forest and is recaptured trying to flee to Austria. To add insult to injury, Francis Kinloch Huger was captured and becomes a prisoner as well. It's actually Lafayette's wife that eventually gets him out through a sort of pity campaign. She goes to Olmütz. She's like, well, you have my husband, and he makes all the money, so I have to live here with my children until you let him out. And then they write all these articles around France that are like, they're imprisoning this poor woman and her children, which is not what happened, but made a really good story and does eventually get him freed. Now, as a publicly active woman in Revolutionary history, it's easy to draw parallels between women like Angelica Schuyler Church and Abigail Adams. For both women, history, even some that has been written since the social history revolution, tends to treat these women as outliers. One could be tempted, for instance, to say that Angelica's liberal education, particular charisma, social position, et cetera, sort of excused her from norms, allowing her influence that was not available to other women in similar positions. But I don't believe that Angelica's Church or Abigail Adams are necessarily exceptional in the way they operated outside of the domestic sphere, especially within the Revolutionary period. If we think about that Joan Kelly quote, where I sort of think that we see this loosening of social constraints, followed by a retightening or backlash in the early 19th century. Instead, what makes Church and Adams exceptional is the quantity and quality of the documentation. Didn't need to do that. That survived to prove their influence. So Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton finishes with a quote that I think is really relevant to this argument: who lives, who dies, who tells your story? A famous Elizabeth line, and we're gonna pick on her for a minute here. One should perhaps add in this case, when is that story told? Because Elizabeth famously destroyed many of her own letters while collecting thousands of her husband's. But less well known is the fact that during her 97-year life, Elizabeth and her son, John Church Hamilton, also carefully curated and edit her family's papers, often removing, very literally redacting, sections that paint her family in an unattractive light. This sort of self-editing is actually pretty common among women who survive into the 19th century, because at that point they're living under this culture that historians either call the Republican motherhood or the cult of domesticity. So by the time Elizabeth is deciding what to keep and what to redact, a woman's place had returned to the domestic sphere exclusively. In the early 19th century, a patriotic woman was considered to be one who was virtuous, motherly, and cared only that her children became good citizens of the new nation. I should say, male children. So there's very little room for intellectual women who craft their own power and influence. In this context, many women took their place, or didn't, in revolutionary history. Elizabeth, it seems, chooses to redact herself almost entirely from her husband's papers, and she may have done the same for other female family members. In contrast, John Adams refused to destroy Abigail's letters, despite repeated pleas from her to do so within her lifetime. But she dies first, and he goes, nope, can't do it. Angelica's letters were not actively gathered, but luckily for us, enough of them have been found in collections, usually of her mail correspondence, to paint a compelling narrative. So in this way, a few women sort of escape this editing of the cult of domesticity and find their way into American history. I believe that their active involvement should not be considered exceptional. Rather, they should be considered emblematic of what's missing from the documentation of their generation, which is this sort of public power that women negotiate through interpersonal networks. So that's the end of my dissertation bit. But of course, as I mentioned, I was asked to talk about Angelica's connections to Oswego. And so we're going to start with that. So a little summary of how much of the land in central and western New York was distributed, which goes something like this. After the American Revolution, large swaths of the New York frontier, which was mostly land seized from the Haudenosaunee and a little bit from British loyalists, gets divided out into plots, which were granted to Continental Army veterans. Often these were either in lieu of back pay they were owed, or in lieu of pensions, because the Continental Congress really doesn't have a lot of fluid cash. And so they're like, oh, we know we said we'd give you a pension, how about 5 acres in the middle of nowhere instead? Although some probably very few veterans moved to take up residence in these plots that they were given, many found it more practical to sell the plots to land speculators, and often without even knowing where those plots were. And this often happened in the same place. A veteran might go to the pension office and they say, here's your 5 acres, it's 200 miles from where you live. And a table over, there would be a land speculator saying, hey, what are you gonna do with 5 acres in the middle of nowhere? I can give you cash instead. So they may not be getting great value for the land, but they were getting cash and they could actually use that. In our case here in Oswego, those initial land speculators who are doing that collecting are 2 brothers named John and Nicholas Roosevelt. They collected the military lots and sell almost 500,000 acres of them to George Scriba in 1792. So this is kind of like a wholesaler selling to a retailer. The Roosevelts collected the land, they don't know or care what's on it, and they sell it at a flat rate to Scriba per acre. So doesn't matter where the acres are, doesn't matter what's on the acres, that this is what we're paying for land. Scriba then figures out what the land is actually worth by doing a land survey, which this is a map of, and prices it for the retail market. So what we're looking at here is the map of land after Scriba had it surveyed, and then he subdivides it, and now it's ready to be sold off to customers. In 1802, Alexander Hamilton, John Lawrence, and John Barker Church bought a large piece of the Scriba patent. The land, which became known as Hamilton's Gore, is described as a triangular plot of land that included the town of Richmond, a large plot of Volney, and Scriba, as well as Vienna in Oneida County. So I've recently been told that there is a map of this, but I had to do a little guesswork based off of that description. But it was almost a third of Scriba's original patent, as roughed out here, including all of those territories. Part of it, you'll note, right up there, abuts directly to the southern end of the city of Oswego. At that point, the city ended at about where the 4th Ward ends now, just past East Albany Street. And so they owned everything from that line southeast. Now, Hamilton and Church and other friends bought numerous other patents throughout New York, and although the family did settle on some small pieces of this land, the size of this parcel should make it clear that they're not purchasing this land for personal use, but rather we've got now a 3rd layer of land speculation. This is an investment property. And in this case, because they are members of the extended Schuyler family, they had really good reason to believe that this land would provide a rapid return on investment. Insider trading. And that's because Philip Schuyler was in the process of building a canal system along the Mohawk River, coming out here towards Oswego eventually. More than 2 decades before the Erie Canal is built, Philip founds the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company in 1792. By that time, his sons-in-law had made their Hamilton Gore, by the time his sons-in-law had made their Hamilton Gore purchase, the canal reached nearly all the way to Oneida Lake, and the company had plans to replace the initial wooden canalway with stone, which they began undertaking in 1803, just after this property is purchased. Philip Schuyler himself and many of his friends and relatives therefore bought up land along the future canal route, knowing that it would gain value as the canal improved accessibility to that land. Now, both Philip Schuyler and Alexander Hamilton die in 1804, and the bulk of the Hamilton Gore property goes untouched until after the deaths of the other two owners. So John Lawrence dies in 1810, and John Barker Church then dies in 1818. So good timing for Rudolph Bunner, because he graduates from Columbia College in 1822, and at that point he takes his young wife, Elizabeth Matilda Church Bunner, I don't have an adult picture of her, so, which is Angelica's youngest daughter. He takes her to Oswego. It seems, in part at least, this was to act as an executor to his wife's family's property out west. As executor, it seems he couldn't place a claim on any of the land contained in the property he was executing, because the Bunners wind up settling on the west side and never live in any of the property that is Hamilton's Gore. More on that in a moment as to where he lived. He was, however, able to turn over a piece of property to Alexander Hamilton and John Barker Church's sister-in-law and her husband, which seems to be how Catherine Van Rensselaer Schuyler Malcolm Cochran, way too many last names, who is Angelica's youngest sister, and her husband, James Cochran, come to live in Oswego in 1826. And you can see some of the details of, in case you can't see from the back there, so Elizabeth Matilda Church marries a Rudolph Bunner in 1805. They moved into Oswego in 1822. And while he's here, he manages a carpet and cloth company, as well as serving on the board of directors of the Oswego Canal Company. James Cochran, Catherine's second husband, moves them to Oswego in 1826, and he works a variety of odd jobs. He's also in politics, so he's like doing things in Albany by mail, and then, but here he works in a couple of newspapers. He founds the Oswego Daily Republican or something. I don't remember the exact, what was it?
I think it's a Daily Palladium or?
Daily,
Yes.
One of those. And he also acts as Oswego postmaster from 1841 to 1845. Now, according to one article, the Bunners originally settled on the corner of West 2nd and Cayuga. That home was demolished in 1967, and it's now a parking lot across from DeForest Jewelers. And I would guess that property was rented while the Bunners were arranging construction of their own home, which is this one, 15 Bronson Street. At the time that they built this, although you can see there's now houses behind it, this lot would have stretched all the way to the lake, which is about where the music hall is now. The house later became the Delta Kappa Kappa fraternity, which burned down in 1983. The Cochrans, meanwhile, were granted a stretch of land described as, quote, the 5 acres of land extending from the present McWhorter Street to the riverfront and extending 200 feet to the north of Cochran Street. So again, kind of an estimate of the property description there. This is, at the time, notably outside the bounds of the city, which only formerly included a little past that Albany Street line again. My guess is that was, I don't know if anyone knows this, but Division Street is that, I would guess that would be the dividing line between city and not city. This land would eventually become part of the 6th Ward, this land, which would eventually become part of the 6th Ward, was added to the city in 1848, but it was not yet designated as its own ward. All the way up until the 1860 census, Catherine and her sons are listed as living at an address still considered to be part of the 4th Ward, despite it being technically outside city limits. Now, Catherine goes on to have two sons who survive into adulthood, both born by her first husband, Samuel Bayard Malcolm. Her eldest, William Schuyler Malcolm, becomes a mercantile captain on the lakes and was well respected for his ability to pilot both steam and sail ships. He lived with his family in an independent residence on his mother's lot until sometime after her death. And at that point, he also builds a home at 85 West Cayuga Street on the west side of the city. That's now the location of St. Mary's of the Assumption Church. Though you'll note as of this map, which is printed in 1880, he still does appear to have part of that property, about half of the property that was part of his mother's estate. I'm not sure if he was living there anymore, as he seems to maintain both residences. Now, Catherine's younger son, Alexander Hamilton Malcolm, was the fail son. He worked as a sailor too, often on William's boats, but it's very clear from Catherine's letters that this was his profession mainly so his brother could keep an eye on him. Otherwise, he got himself into trouble, and we don't know exactly what that trouble is, but probably alcohol, gambling, sailor things. So Alexander lives with his mother until at least his 40s. He remains single, and at some point after 1855, when he last appears on her census record, probably shortly after her death, he moves to Willard, New York. So with the exception of Alexander, all of the Bunner, Malcolm, and Cochran family members that I've mentioned here are buried at Riverside Cemetery. So you'll find their plots there. Now, you've probably already noticed in this map, we've got quite a few names that pop up from our story thus far. We have our Hamilton Gore purchasers, Hamilton, Church, and Lawrence Street. We've got Cochran and Bunner Street for the families who took up residence in Oswego. And we even have Roosevelt and Scriba, who purchased and resold that land. Of course, further north by the fort, we also have Schuyler Street, named not only because of the family connections, but because of Philip Schuyler's service here in 1756 under his long-term mentor, General John Bradstreet. Bradstreet was so close to Schuyler, by the way, that he actually lives in Schuyler Mansion up until his death in 1774. So this is likely why Schuyler Street is positioned closer to the fort rather than down in the area where the rest of the family actually lived and owned property. Numerous other names through the city certainly had close family ties and caught my attention as I was writing this. Most notably to me, on the west side, there's a Varick Street, which is likely named for the statesman Richard Varick. Now, Varick actually got his political and military start as an aide-de-camp for Philip Schuyler from 1775 to 1780. By the end of which he's administering the entire northern department of the Continental Army because Philip is constantly sick. So this role, and probably how much work he took on because of it, get him subsequent jobs as aide-de-camp and recording secretary for first Benedict Arnold and then George Washington. Now, Oswego is not the only place that the Schuyler family, or Angelica specifically, left their mark. In fact, just over 100 miles southwest of Oswego lies the town of Angelica, New York, named for. This property was also originally issued as military plots, but in this case they wound up in the hands of Governor Morris, a fellow post-revolutionary expatriate of Angelica's, who visited them in England, and he also happened to be a gambling buddy of John Barker Church's. So apparently, Morris, having no need for this land out west, paid his gambling debts that he owed to John with that land. And the land winds up being managed by John and Angelica's son, Philip Church, who makes his home there, and designates the street plan of the town, basing it off of his birth city of Paris, and naming it after his mother. So while it's unlikely that Angelica ever visits Oswego, since she dies in 1814 before her family moves here in the 20s, she and her husband build a home in Angelica, New York, which she has an active hand in designing. It's sort of intended to be their retirement estate, but unfortunately Angelica dies just before they can move into the home, and John Barker Church decides at that point to move back to England for the remainder of his life. So that brings us to the end. But I'd love to answer questions if you've got any.
Yes, Dan.
So
I can't help but notice you did start with a July 4th, 1776 letter, and as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, Angelica represents so much of the revolutionary story and the development of women in that time. How might we locate or identify more of those stories, and how might we celebrate those as we start entering into our 250th celebrations in the world like that?
What a professor question. I mean, I think it's just important to highlight these kind of more minor stories because they allow us to access a lot of voices that aren't contained in the sort of general tracks out there. I think there's been a really great effort. Again, it tends to me to focus on the women who we've always treated as exceptions. So I've already seen a lot of stuff out there about Abigail Adams, but I want to see some of these quieter stories because I think they allow us to explore, just people we don't think about and people that we don't always, pay attention to. Does that answer? Yeah. Yes.
There is a collection of stories that was collected by a woman named Elizabeth F. Ellett. She was of Sodus. Actually, she was born in what is now Sodus Point. Anyway, in the 1840s, she published 3 volumes of books that she called the Women of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
And it does look at just ordinary people. She glorifies them. I understand that. They're all wonderful.
Yeah. And that's.
But behind those, if you read between the lines, there's stories that are really important.
And that strikes a chord with me because that's what a lot of my research has been, because so many of the stories, the like specific narratives we have about women like Angelica and her sisters are these are published in the 19th century, like in the early to mid 19th century, when people are really actively they're really actively thinking about and trying to collect the story. Obviously, they know they've lived through something major and they want to record it, but they're recording it through this lens. And so there is a lot of like, oh, these are really great stories, and I have to take them with such a grain of salt because we're really filtering it through their cultural ideology at the time, which has really strongly gendered. And so it's kind of, I think they are a wonderful source, and we need those anecdotes, and then we have to go through and be like, okay, where did they get this anecdote? Can I find a letter from the time that confirms that anecdote?
Have you found at all any of the, I have tried to look for the papers of Elizabeth Ellett, and they're just not there.
I'm not familiar with them, so I'm not sure, but I haven't read her book, but I would be very interested too.
It's a 3-volume. It's really
When
I first,
books.
I'll be honest, when I first read it back in the 70s, I was like, oh God, this is terrible.
Yeah.
But as I look at it now, I say, wait a minute, this woman really did an incredible amount of research.
Yeah.
And it's
And without a computer, like they're just.
I don't know how she did it.
And not even libraries or archives really fully developed at that time. So you're like, asking friends for letters that they found in their attic kind of thing. It's really amazing. Yeah.